Welcome to our Heritage Lecture. Thank you for joining us. My name is Cindy Kunis, and I'm the Projects Coordinator at Delaware River Greenway Partnership. DRGP works to preserve and enhance the Delaware River's natural, cultural, and recreational resources. Part of our mission is education. Our presentation explores the history of the proposed Tocks Island Dam. I'd like to thank David Pierce for sharing his expertise. He is an author and retired journalist who has extensively researched the Tocks Island Dam project and the creation of the Delaware Gap National Recreation Area. His Tocks Island, Dam If You Do, the Homegrown Movement that defeated the Delaware River Dam book he authored recounts the contentious and heart-wrenching history of the federally approved dam. If you have a question, please add it to the Q&A section and we'll answer them at the end. David Pierce, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Cindy, and thanks to everyone at the Greenway Partnership for inviting me into your homes this evening. The first slide you're looking at happens to be the name of my book. It's called Tocks Island Dam If You Do, the Homegrown Movement that defeated the Delaware River Dam. And on the right side is a photo of the Delaware River, the middle section of the river at the Delaware Water Gap. Next slide, please. And this is what we'll be talking about this evening. On the left is the cover of a land acquisition brochure produced by the Army Corps of Engineers back in the early 1960s, actually dated 1967. It was a booklet that the Army Corps handed out to people who were losing their homes, farms, or other businesses. A lot of summer camps as well in this area that the government deemed valuable enough to take to from these private owners for a dam, a 37-mile reservoir, and a surrounding national recreation area. And on the right is a picture of the southern tip of Tocks Island, and that's just south of Tocks Island. They were searching for a precise location over the years, but that's where they wanted to build the dam, with everything north of there creating a reservoir or a large lake of 37 miles. Next slide, please. And the section today is designated as a federal wild and scenic river, the 40-mile central part, and that designation was awarded by President Carter in 1978, and also a 70-mile northern section separating New York State and Pennsylvania also got the designation that year. And today, the Delaware River, it's 330 miles long, and it is the longest undammed river east of the Mississippi. And because it's undammed, ocean shad, it's a herring fish. It lives most of its life out in the Atlantic Ocean, but they come back up river to spawn in fresh water, but live most of their lives out in the ocean, and it's the benefits from being undammed, because most other river basins, like the Connecticut River, the Susquehanna River, they are dammed, and they do have fish ladders to help the fish kind of bypass the dam and get to their spawning grounds. But by and large, from what I've read, those fish ladders do not work very well, and The Delaware River is fortunate to have that free flowing shad runs. But that's not to say that the Delaware River hasn't been impacted by development and by humans as well as the other rivers, because New York City, to meet its water needs, it has dammed 3 headwaters, tributary streams, the east and west branches of the Delaware, and the Neversink River, which flows into the Delaware. And what has happened in essence is that New York City is diverting 800 million gallons a day of water that used to flow into Delaware, but it's diverting that before it ever reaches the river. So although it's a natural flow, it's a lower flow. Next slide, please. And this is shows several Delaware River basin reservoir plans. The Army Corps they produced this map circa 1957, and many of these, but not all of these projects came to fruition, but this is what was on the drawing board then. And if you look at the top of that map, there's a dotted line that leads from the reservoirs in upstate New York to New York City, and that was an aqueduct or a tunnel. And when that was built in the 1950s, it was billed as the world's longest tunnel, 80 miles long, to move water in upstate New York down to New York City every day. Anyway, I just thought I would point that out. New York City, as far back as the 20s, had proposals to tap those reservoirs to meet its growing water needs. But of course, Pennsylvania and New Jersey, they provided some resistance because they were worried about that lower river flow coming down to the middle river, and they're worried about their own water needs being met. And the Supreme Court in 1931 issued a decision that allowed 2 of those reservoirs to be tapped by New York. And then in the early 50s, a case went back to the Supreme Court when New York State wanted to have a third reservoir diversion of water to New York, and a compromise was reached. New York State negotiated with New Jersey, and New Jersey agreed to not stand in the way of New York having a third reservoir if New Jersey could meet some of its own urban water needs. And then after that, New Jersey and Pennsylvania negotiated building a dam at Walpeck Bend in the middle Delaware River to a 2-state project to meet their needs. And New Jersey quickly approved a plan in 1953. And then in 1955, Governor Minor of New Jersey and members of the New Jersey legislature, they actually traveled to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania capital, and negotiated a final agreement with Pennsylvania and Governor Leader to jointly develop a dam at Walpeck Bend that would have been about 28 miles reservoir would have been created. And there would have been a side reservoir that would be in the Flatbrook Creek in New Jersey, a smaller reservoir kind of hooked on to the larger reservoir. But anyway, about 2 months, actually a little less than 2 months after they approved that, there was a great flood in 1955, which didn't, no one died on the Delaware River itself, but 75 people died on the Broadhead Creek, which flows in Monroe County. It actually divides Stroudsburg and East Stroudsburg, among other areas in Monroe County. And 75 people drowned in a flood in August of 55 on the Broadhead. And then there are another 13 people who died up in Pike County. I believe 11 of those along Pawpack Creek. And after that happened, the federal government, the U.S. Senate passed a resolution saying before Pennsylvania, New Jersey, or anyone else does anything else with the Delaware River Basin, we should have a comprehensive study looking at all the water needs and how they're going to be met in the basin. And President Eisenhower also agreed and issued an order for the Army Corps of Engineers to conduct this study, and in conjunction with other agencies and with the 4 Delaware River Basin states, which are New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the state of Delaware. Next slide, please. And in the wake of the flood, as I mentioned, there were delays that in the Walpack Bend project, and there were hearings conducted by the Army Corps. They had 3 meetings a year in which different agencies went to, and they had progress reports on, I don't know, things like the presence of mosquitoes and how would building a dam affect mosquito-borne diseases, and all sorts of different studies, and looking at how best to move forward. And meanwhile, the 4 governors and the 2 big city mayors, the mayors of Philadelphia and New York City, and the governors of the basin states, they sought development of a new basin regulatory agency because they were tired of fighting amongst themselves over water needs, but they also didn't want the federal government to solely dictate what is done in the basin. So they thought an agency with both representatives of each of the 4 governors and representatives of the President of the United States, that those 5 people or their delegates could jointly administer the water needs of the Delaware River Basin populace. And a Syracuse University report developed this idea of the 5-member board, and in 1961, the 4 state legislatures and Congress approved creation of the Delaware River Basin Commission. The administration of President John F. Kennedy had just taken office in 61, and at first they thought that the feds and the state working together, that the 3 states could vote to override the federal government. They thought that was unconstitutional at first, but finally they agreed to go ahead and approve it. And they figured that since Congress would have to approve any project involving federal funds, that would always be a check on the power of the states, because the states would want the feds to substantially fund projects. And so in 1962, Congress also approved building a dam. This time, the dam would be located at Tocks Island further south, so that instead of so they could have a 37-mile reservoir that would actually hold 60% more water than what the Walpeck Bend Dam would have held. And the funny thing about that is that the reason why Pennsylvania and New Jersey wanted to build their dam at Walpeck Bend to begin with is that the Army Corps itself did a study back in the 40s that said that the loose glacial till left over from the Ice Age would be too porous and would bring water in, seeping into the dam, and could actually cause a dam burst, and it was an unsafe location. And that's why they went with Walpeck Bend, where there seemed to be a lot of bedrock to support a dam. And but the Army Corps said that the 1940 study was not that extensive, and that they felt that somewhere south of Tocks Island that they could find a good location for a larger dam and reservoir. Next slide, please. This is Nancy Shakaitis, and I call her a one-woman dam opposition. Actually, there were a few people opposed before her and very actively doing so, but she was unique in that she was one of 6 generations in her family that had mostly through farming had lived on the land where they're looking at taking property for the reservoir as well, and for the surrounding national recreation area. And she initially joined an anti-dam committee in the hamlet of Bushkill, which was and still is, although it's in federal hands now, it's on the border between Monroe and Pike County. And there were other opponents before her, but what made Nancy unique is that she was the only opponent who testified at public hearings held outside the region. And one of the she had a high school diploma. She actually worked as a secretary at what was then called East Stroudsburg State Teachers College, but she never got a college degree herself. She was never a mass organizer or a public speaker, but she took to the task right away, and she kind of had a lot of energy. I guess you could say a lot of anger that this farm that was in her family for 6 generations was going to be taken from them for a price, but against their will. And what made her unique is that she was the only person out of these opponents who had traveled to the public hearings on Tocks Island and other aspects of the Delaware River Basin, because they weren't holding meetings here in the middle Delaware where these projects were to take place. You know, they would hold them in Washington, D.C., of course, and in Philadelphia, and even in New York City every now and then. And at the very first meeting that she attended, it was a Delaware River Basin Commission meeting in Philly, in which they were going to discuss, the DRBC called the meeting to hear the public's views on what the public thought should be funding priorities for the river basin. And she was seated near Mayor George Smith, who spoke before she did. And while Mayor Smith spoke, they had a film projector, and they were projecting a slide on a screen that showed dead bodies laid out in a row, covered in white sheets. And there was a reference to the 1955 flood. And the mayor of Easton, while those images were on the screen, the mayor of Easton was saying, that we need uh, uh, the Tocks Island Dam and Reservoir in order to save lives in Easton. Because the, uh, and if there was a dam that in 1955, some lives could have been saved. And then Nancy is looking at those slides, and she realizes that no one died in the Delaware. And as a matter of fact, it looks like that's from Lanterman Funeral Home in East Stroudsburg, not far from her house. So when it was her turn to speak, she had her typewritten notes that she was going to read, but she had the presence of mind of calling the mayor out on it, Mayor George Smith, and saying that's not true. No one died in the Delaware, and that's from East Stroudsburg and the people who died on Broadhead Creek. And then she read her statement, and she sat down, and I asked her, well, how did the mayor react to that? And she said, I didn't want to sit back down next to him when he when I finished, and I overheard him say to an aide that some public relations outfit must have gotten her to say that. And Nancy is thinking, here I am opposing all these different forces, politicians and different organizations, a broad spectrum of different groups that were backing this project. And then he's talking about me having a public relations outfit. What PR outfit would that be? Next slide, please. And again, the dam was approved in 1962. And in 1965, Congress finally got around to final hearings before voting on whether to approve the national recreation area that would go around the dam and the reservoir. And Nancy went to Washington, testified before this House subcommittee considering it, and she continued to focus on the issue of dam safety. And the chairman of the subcommittee holding the hearing said, we're not here to talk about the dam. It's already been approved. And we're here to talk about the national recreation area. And then Nancy said, you really owe it to us, to the people who are impacted by this project, to hold a public hearing in the region where you're going to do this, and you should travel there and talk to the people before you vote to do that. And this chairman said, don't think that we're going to go to every nook and cranny for every project, because we have to vote on issues all the time in Washington, and we can't just pick up and leave our other responsibilities to come to the region for every project that comes along. But the chairman added that we'll leave the public record open for another 5 days so that anyone who wants to submit written comments, they can do that. And Nancy went home, and the next day she launched a petition drive to have a hearing in the region. And she left petition copies at stores and post offices from East Stroudsburg all the way north into Port Jervis, New York. And a couple of days later, she collected the signatures. She had 630 signatures, sent those in, and then she rounded up another round of signatures and sent them in. And the subcommittee agreed to hold a public hearing, a one-day hearing, which was held at East Stroudsburg High School. Today that's East Stroudsburg South High School, but back then there was only one high school in East Stroudsburg. And And actually, the faculty and staff were among people where petitions were dropped off and they signed them. And then the public hearing was held there. And the last thing she did just before the hearing is that she went to about 40 of her neighbors in Middle Smithfield Township, Pennsylvania, and got them to agree to form a anti-dam committee called the Delaware Valley Conservation Association, and they testified at that hearing. However, there were more people that were in favor of the dam than against it, and Congress eventually voted to create the recreation area anyway. Next slide, please. Okay. This is the church, one of the churches in Bushkill, and this this church. I read a story in the Pocono Record during this era, and it said that if the dam had been built, Bushkill about 2/3 the height of that church building would have been underwater if the dam had been built. Next slide, please. Dam opposition continued to build and anti-recreationary sentiment among some people, even after those projects had been approved by the Congress and were finalized. And even though those projects were finalized, they had to compete every year for funding for different phases of it. So, so the Delaware Valley Conservation Association, which was formed by Nancy Shakaitis in 1966, they decided to, that organization that started out with 40 people in their neighborhood, they decided that they would go into several localized locations, particularly in the state of New Jersey, and recruit 500 new members for their organization. And they went to a couple of large subdivisions and knocked on doors and talked to people about the projects and what they could do about it, and sign them up as members. And they offered advice about how to deal with the Army Corps' appraisers who set the prices that the government was willing to pay to take their properties, and different strategies like that. And Charles Coons of Sandyston Township, New Jersey, he became Delaware Valley Conservation Association president, and he had spoken out for a few years, particularly against the recreation area. And then later on that year, in 1966, the DVCA filed a suit in federal district court trying to reverse the land acquisitions programs on grounds that Congress wasn't appropriating enough money for the Army Corps to pay fair prices for their properties. And that suit lost in district court, and they lost their appeals, but they continued to fight the dam. And another anti-dam opponent, this is kind of interesting. Her name is Joan Matheson, originally from Monroe County, but she married an Army Corps colonel who was a West Point engineering graduate. He was actually an Army engineer, Colonel David Matheson, and they bought a property in 1960, 2 years before the dam was approved, in Dingman's Ferry, Pike County, in the flood zone, as it turned out. And in 1962, they they basically boarded up their home for a couple of years because Colonel Matheson was assigned to go to France to oversee the graves of American soldiers who died in World War II. So they were there for 4 years. And then in 1966, Joan Matheson came home. She she decided to start an anti-dam newspaper. And she went there like any reporter would go, and she would take notes, ask questions, and write stories. A lot of them sarcastic stories, but she really went after the dam and what they alleged were safety problems with the dam. And a year later, David Matheson retired from the Army, and he went back and got his teaching certificate and taught at chemistry and other subjects at Newton High School, New Jersey. And Jo Matheson produced her publication from the cellar of her L-shaped brick home. And on the right there, she did a lot of artwork for her publication as well. And that's one of the pieces of art that she did. And she said that she, according to her daughter, she said that Joan got the idea for the newspaper from a satirical newspaper in France that she discovered there while they were stationed in France, and it was kind of patterned after that. And she called it the Menacing Bull, as you can imagine, like BS. That's what she felt were some of the claims being made by dam proponents. And meanwhile, Nancy Shakaitis, the Delaware Valley Conservation Association expanded. They had leadership in place, and she started to turn more of her attention to party politics. And she ran for, and in 1967 was elected as a Monroe County Commissioner. And as a matter of fact, she was the first woman in history to be elected a Monroe County Commissioner. And the Pocono Record at that time said that they were not positive on this point, but they said that Nancy was also believed to be the first woman to be a county commissioner in any county in Pennsylvania. But so she joined a 3-member board, and her elected position helped give the movement additional clout to fight the dam. Next slide, please. An uphill battle, and this really gets kind of complicated because not only was there a Tocks Island Dam, but 3 New Jersey utilities wanted to piggyback another smaller dam onto the project through pump storage. And when they say pump storage, they're basically talking about a gravity-fed hydroelectric project where water would be pumped right out of the Tocks Island Reservoir and go uphill. And the Kittatinny Ridge was very steep, and it rises at that point about 800 feet high. And so they're talking about pumping the water like at 2 o'clock in the morning when people are not using as much electricity, and pumping it at 800 feet high and then 400 feet over. And they wanted to take a glacial lake called Sunfish Pond and triple the size of that, basically obliterate the lake, but expand upon it and make that the upper reservoir. And then when there is peak demand for electricity, they could drop the water down again, which would turn the turbines and create the electricity and end up back in the Delaware River. And this gentleman, Glenn Fisher, he lived in the Pennsylvania side, but he liked hiking the New Jersey portion of the Appalachian Trail, uh, which went right by Sunfish Pond. Uh, he used to hike that a lot, and he got wind of this proposal. And Glenn Fisher is kind of interesting. He was actually a federal soil scientist, U.S. Soil Conservation Service employee, and he eventually quit his job, and he launched an anti-dam protest group called the Lenni Lenape League, named after the original Aboriginal inhabitants of our area, and he organized protest hikes to Sunfish Pond. And when I talk about an anti-dam group, their sole focus was on stopping the electrical utilities and this pump storage project. And one of the reasons why the utilities were able to consider utilizing pump storage was because there was a state forest here, about 6,000 acres of state forest, and in 1960 they reached agreement with Governor Minor of New Jersey to sell 700 acres out of the 6,000 acres to the utilities. And then the utilities announced in that 1960 era that they were hoping to utilize pump storage. And they also said, while we're at it, we would even operate the Tocks Island Dam for you if you would like. And Glenn Fisher organized hundreds of people at one point in the summer of '66 who hiked up to the pond saying, let's protect it. And then other people joined the movement, the Lenni Lenape League. And one of them was Casey Kays of Hackettstown, New Jersey, who wrote letters to legislators demanding that they buy back this property from the state and retake the site from the utilities. And in his letter writing, Casey Kays also wrote to a sitting U.S. Supreme Court Justice, William O. Douglas, and Justice Douglas agreed in 1967 to join a protest hike up to Sunfish Pond, and that created a lot of momentum to save Sunfish Pond. And the utilities at first said, well, we'll save Sunfish, but we'll build our reservoir about 1,000 feet away. And Lenni Lenape League members said, no, that would still, the river water would seep over the lake and cause some other problems, including possibly excessive growth of algae, and that would deplete the oxygen and kill off fish and animal life. And the utilities kicked around a couple other ideas, and finally the utilities gave back 100 acres just on their own to the state, along with the pond. They returned it back to the state, but kept 600 acres to themselves, and that's the way things stand today. Next slide, please. And moving right along, this is what happened to a lot of houses that were sold in the flood zone. They had to be moved out of there. They had to not only get, in many cases, they demolish the buildings and the rubble, and they dig up the septic systems and underground heating fuel systems and heating fuel tanks, and on both the Pennsylvania and New Jersey sides, there are steep inclines, and so they would drive to the tops of these ridges and bury the rubble and make sure that the reservoir area was clean for the water that was going to go there. But in but there were other cases where the owners didn't want the buildings, and so they would actually sell these buildings for, say, in many cases, it would be $100 to take a building off their hands, but the building would have to be moved by vehicle. Many times they would cut it in 6 or 7 pieces to move it, and then you'd have to buy a piece of property, private property, to place that building on to, and then you have to hook up the utilities again, and so you're into several $1,000s by the time that's all done. But that has been done on both sides of the river throughout the region, and there are buildings dotting the area that people have no idea that there are once in the Tocks region. And as you can imagine, the people losing their homes, especially the ones who felt like they're giving up riverside property but not getting equal value for their money from the government, and saying that they had to downsize basically. They could not find anything comparable for the money outside of what the feds were taking over, and that those sales tactics and the growing environmental consciousness, both in the region and nationally, was changing a lot of public opinion to being more anti-dam as the years rolled on. Next slide, please. And this is just a portion of Army Corps' land acquisition map showing the progress of acquisitions. In this case, this is a map in August of 1972. They started buying up properties basically in late 65, early 66 is when they started. And in 1972, this is where they were in Walpack Township, New Jersey. And I will explain these colors here. Well, first of all, in the upper portion of the map, across from the blue lines in green, that's Pennsylvania. And then the river's in the middle, and then the lower part of the map is New Jersey. And the color coding shows what the Army Corps had purchased up to that date. And the dark pink were reservoir areas that they had bought, and then the blank areas were areas that they still had to acquire. And the green areas were the recreational properties. And you could see that they were making much better progress in acquiring recreational area lands than they were with reservoir areas. And that was partly because the Interior Department and the National Park Service, they had some federal funds based on fees collected at other parks that they could use to buy up land, but the reservoir area was not eligible for NPS acquisitions. And Walpack Township, meanwhile, it's hard to see in this map, but there's just a tiny little peninsula yeah, kind of up a little bit. There's like a thin strip of land that would have remained, and that would have been it for Walpack Township. Once all the acquisitions were made. And at the same time, Walpack is seeing their entire township survival is at stake. There are people, pre-existing developers, who had their subdivisions there, and like Blue Mountain Lakes is one of them. And 300 plus homes that had been placed there, and they had sold 3,500 parcels, but there were 300 of those sites had homes on them, and they went back and won approval from Walpack to build 670 new homes, which meant if the Army Corps didn't get money in a hurry, that which they weren't going to get money in a hurry, that they would have to pay a lot more for those properties because they'd have homes on them. And actually federal officials, and including the Interior Secretary, the U.S. Interior Secretary, and the Army Corps, they were trying to pressure the municipal officials not to allow any more development, but they had limited success doing that. But they slowly did acquire most, not all, but most of the lands in this area. And Walpack Township, which in the 1970 census had about 280 year-round residents, and had about twice that many people who had vacation homes and spent time there primarily in the summer. But today, less than 20 people call Walpack Township home. Yet, despite having fewer than 20 people, they still have a state-recognized township municipal government, and they continue to operate, and they have managed to preserve a few buildings in Walpack Center that they open up for public events every year. Next slide, please. And this is more about Walpack Township. I just wanted to show this because there were, while the township is fighting the federal government, they're also fighting one particular developer who had basically, going all the way back to the 20s, there was a development, and they sold some lots, built a few houses with that development, but not too many. And then in the 50s, another developer came along and bought some property that ended up with the bank. Apparently went into foreclosure, from what I could find out in my research, and they started subdividing and selling lots without extinguishing the original covenants on the land, and which is a violation of federal law. And then worse than that, some subdivided land in the 50s was on the same land that had already been sold in the 20s and 30s to other buyers, and they weren't sure who they were. And the current generation in the 60s and 70s of Walpack Township, that board, the committeemen were trying to sort that all out and to get those back taxes to help their dwindling tax base. At the same time, they're also fighting the federal government. So you can imagine what a convoluted mess that was. Next slide, please. You could keep going. Boom. And this is on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware River. And the area that shown here is just north of Shawnee on Delaware, Pennsylvania. And it's, as you can see, there's a lot of farming that takes place here. And the river is on the right. And then out of view of this photo, but but beyond it is the state of New Jersey. New Jersey property in the reservoir area. And Tocks Island itself isn't very far away from here. And over in the New Jersey area, they were doing, the Army Corps of Engineers hired a contractor who was doing work to create a 700 foot test tunnel. And it was actually a horizontal test tunnel going sideways into the ridge. And they're creating this tunnel for the Army Corps so that the Army Corps could go in and do earth stratification tests, and to try to figure out if that would be a good location for the reservoir. And to do this, it's very rocky soil. They were blasting, they're using dynamite to blast into the rock, and there would be explosions every 2 or 3 days. There would be explosions from mid 1968, the summer of 1968 through the early winter of 1969. There would be blasting every now and then. And that, as I said, it's not even in this photo, but it's about 2/3 of a mile away from Sal and Mary Edna Papalardo's home. And if you look to the left of this photo, you'll see River Road, and off of River Road, there's like a Y. Yeah, there's a road that's like a Y. Yes, that's it. And it veers off, and there are 3 houses there, and one of them is the Papalardo house. And every time this contractor was blasting for the test tunnel, their house would shake. And then they noticed that there are cracks in their walls, their ceilings, their floors. They had large cracks in their tile, which is, and poor Sal Papalardo, he laid tile for a living, yet his tile was just getting decimated by this blasting. And so Sal and Mary Edna, they contacted several times. They contacted the Army Corps' official, the office in charge of land acquisition, didn't hear back. They kept contacting their congressman and didn't hear back. And then finally, the congressman did reach them, and he said that the congressman said, "I've gotten an answer out of the Army Corps," and this was in late December of '68, and the message is that the contractor has just about completed everything they need for this test tunnel, and if you and we're not going to compensate you for the damage to the property, but our contractor will. They're the ones who are legally responsible. Here's the name of the contractor, and you contact them, and it'll be up to them to make amends for the property damages done to your building. But we're going to pay it on appraisals based on the current decreased value of your home. And so they invited a couple of representatives from the contractor who came in, looked things over. They didn't commit one way or another, but according to Mary Edna in her family memoirs, she said that the 2 of them seemed quite shocked at the extent of the damage, but they didn't admit that that's what caused it. And so the next thing the Papalardos did is they hired an attorney. They went to Monroe County Court, and the contractor didn't even go to court, but they had a trial, and the court awarded them something like $14,000 in compensation for the damage done, and said that the contractor is legally responsible for that. And of course, they were overjoyed that at least they're going to get some of their money back out of the house. And about a week after that, the Pappalardo's attorney calls them and says, "I've got bad news for you. The contractor just filed for bankruptcy protection in the federal district court, federal bankruptcy court. And there are so many creditors, there's just no way that you're ever going to get money from them for the damage that was done." And so the Pappalardos moved out in 1971. And meanwhile, the attorney continued to lobby the federal government to give them better compensation. And finally, the feds in 1974 agreed to raise the value, their compensation by $8,000. So instead of 23,000, it was about 31,000 for the property. And I think something like 1/3 of that maybe went to the attorney, but they did get some additional money in 1974. And then Sal Pappalardo passed away within months. He had emphysema, and he died shortly after that. But Mary Edna, his wife, lived to be 103 and died in 2021 during the pandemic. And there's one more reason why I wanted to focus on this photo here. This is also where, I don't know if you've heard the story about the Tocks Island squatters, but this was a squatter stronghold that the Army Corps was so behind the 8 ball on trying to acquire properties. It was going so slowly, and yet they owned this property that had to be watched and protected. And they said, how are we going to continue to do that? We don't want people vandalizing it or you know, stealing copper pipes or whatever might be going on. And perhaps what we could do is we'll create a rental program. And so that's what the Army Corps did, that they started renting out properties that they had bought against not really willing sellers at all. They took their property, and then the original inhabitants moved out, and these other people moved in. And a lot of the advertising for these rental units were in papers like the Village Voice and other publications in New York. And they got a lot of young people with alternative lifestyles, what were called back in my youth in the 60s and 70s are basically hippies. And that did not sit well with, especially the people who lost their homes, but with the area residents, that didn't sit very well. And the Governor Shapp of Pennsylvania said that when they were asked to have the state police remove the squatters, they said, well, we'll enforce any other law, but this is the government's property and it's up to the government to remove them. And so the Army Corps, working through the U.S. Attorney's Office, they got some U.S. Marshals to, in 1971, to raid some of these homes, knock on the doors, told these squatters or these occupiers that you have 10 minutes to get out, and then and then the Army Corps was right behind the Marshals with hired contractors who had these front end loaders that they used to knock down these buildings on the spot as soon as they could get people out. And they managed to knock down about 6 buildings and a barn. And then what happened is that as people in a subdivision, in a couple of the subdivision, noticed that this is going on. When other people were asked to leave, they started climbing up on the rooftops, and they just refused to leave. And by this time, U.S. Marshals had left, and it was just the Army Corps and these private contractors. And of course, the private contractors don't want to have anything to do with dealing with the liability of people on rooftops and so forth. And so basically, they fought off eviction that day, and it became a court battle. And this went on for almost 3.5 years. And then finally, in February of 1974, federal marshals came back, and this time they removed all the squatters, but a lot of the damage was done. People were upset about the squatters' presence, but more so, they blamed the Army Corps itself for creating the problem by having the rental program. And that was one of the things that contributed to killing the dam. In 1975, when the 4 river basin state governors voted 3-1, only Governor Shapp of Pennsylvania wanted to continue to build the dam, but the other 3 voted to not build the dam. And that's although the demise wasn't official until 1992, the Army Corps after 75 never promoted the dam in any way. They had had enough. Next slide, please. And and that was one of the things that killed the dam. And then inflation, which from what I remember is probably worse then than even what we've gone through over these last 3 or 4 years with the inflation. That it started with the Vietnam War, that so much money is being poured into the war effort that that was the reason why it took so long to acquire land for the recreation area, and the dam was because all other federal programs that didn't involve the war effort, they were looking to spend less money so that they could deal with American involvement in Vietnam. I mean, and then I mentioned the squatters. And also in New Year's Day, 1970, President Nixon signed legislation created by Congress called the National Environmental Policy Act. And one of the things that NEPA did, well, there are a couple of things. It created the White House Council on Environmental Quality, which was authorized to comment on any and all federal projects that involved an environmental impact. And then also NEPA required a public hearing on any project, a public hearing on the environmental impact of any project receiving federal funds. And because of that, it made it easier for national environmental groups to join in, and the local groups did get some national reinforcements. And then around late 1971, I believe, the Lenni Lenape League broadened from not just opposing pump storage hydroelectric, but opposing the Delaware River Dam as well. And 2 counties, Monroe in Pennsylvania, Warren County in New Jersey, had non-binding voter referendums in 1972 in which they solidly voted against having a dams, and by smaller margins, they voted to take property that was originally going to be for the dam and use it for an expanded national recreation area. And that's my presentation. Sorry that it took so long, but if you want to know more about this fascinating topic, please consider ordering my book on Amazon.com, Tocks Island Dam. If you do, if you have any questions, I'll do my best to answer them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So yeah, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and looks like I already have two. The report recommending DRBC, was that Syracuse University, Law and Public Policy Department, or the School of Environmental Science and Forestry?
You know, I wish I have a copy of the report. It was put into a book, and I have it upstairs, but I don't have it handy. But I think the first organization is the correct one, but I would have to double check that. Is Professor Roscoe, I can't think of his last name, but his first name is Roscoe, who headed up the department that did that study.
Okay, have a comment. This was excellent. I'm so glad that you had it recorded to listen again. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Yes, thank you. That was a great comment. And anybody else have questions, comments, anything? Just checking chat. I don't see anything. Oh, here we go. Please explain, how does New York City get water from upstate when the tunnel wasn't built?
When the tunnel wasn't built, frankly, I'm not as well versed on New York State as I am about the subject of my book, but I think that tunnel was well. They approved the first two reservoirs in 1931, but they didn't finish completing them until the mid-50s. And I think the tunnel was also completed at that same time frame. I guess that after approval, 1931 was in the early days of the Great Depression. And then we went from the Great Depression to fighting World War II. So it wasn't until the late 40s that New York State could think seriously of actually completing their reservoirs. And in the early 50s, I know that when they went back to the Supreme Court for the third reservoir, the first two reservoirs had not yet been completed.
Okay, how important do you feel the geological uncertainties at Tocks Island site were for undermining the damming?
To what extent? I would think probably to a great extent, but it took a long time. And I think that was, those concerns were probably one of the keys in turning public opinion against the dam. I mean, I think if local public opinion supported the dam, there's a good chance they would have ignored people who are concerned about the glacial till, and they would have gone ahead and did the best they could to find a place. And I think when it comes to a dam bursting, the bigger problem was the water from underneath coming up from the bottom. And if you can't reach bedrock, then you have some real problems. But the Army Corps has always felt that even if bedrock was really far down in there, that they could compensate for the possibility of the dam bursting by building a support structure over the top of the dam and kind of compressing everything down. That would be the solution that would keep the dam intact. Of course, some people disagreed with that, but anyway, I think public changing public opinion was the key.
Absolutely. Was Congresswoman Helen Maynor involved?
Yes, Helen Minor, she was the wife of the governor who did that transfer of property at Worthington Forest to the 3 electrical utilities, and she was elected to Congress in the mid-70s. I think it might have been 74 that she was elected, and before that, she actually held stock in the utilities companies, and after she won the Democratic primary for Congress, she sold her holdings, her stock, and then after she was elected, a lot of the activists were really pushing her to come out and say, "What's your stand on the dam?" And finally, she did, and she said, "I'm against the dam," and that was a key moment, and then after the governors voted 3-1 in 1975 not to build the dam, they met a month later and along with, well, 3 out of the 4 governors met, and they decided that they didn't want to officially abandon it. They wanted to wait 25 years just to make sure that there wouldn't be a sudden demand for the water, and that the Delaware River, if it was harnessed, could produce. And Helen Minor introduced legislation after that a couple of times, trying to make the dam's demise official and final, but other politicians actually impeded that. So it's kind of interesting, even though her husband was involved in one way, she kind of became anti-dam towards the end of her time in Congress.
Were any of the original property owners ever to reclaim their land?
Not to reclaim it, but they're from about circa 1980-81, the government got to the point where they hadn't completed acquisitions, but they decided from now on, we are only going to take property from willing sellers. They weren't going to use eminent domain anymore. And there are some properties, especially on the New Jersey side, but some properties in Pennsylvania too, that remain in private hands to this day. And there have even been disputes. I know there's one property, and I think it was in Sussex County, New Jersey, that the private property owners were also claiming part of what was once a public road, saying that that's part of our property now, and they had disputes that went to court with the Park Service, but for the most part, they just live peaceably there in the park. And by the way, I should call it a recreation area and not a national park, because the designation means different things, and there's actually a movement by some people who want to turn it into the formal designation of the national park, and others who are organized opposed to it, and different people feel different ways about it, and some think the changing designation won't make much difference, but the opponents of calling it a national park are worried that that will even increase more tourism and kind of overrun people's way of life in the region.
Absolutely. Thanks for making that distinction. What inspired you to research and write this book?
Well, in 1969, I was 14 years old, and I moved to Monroe County, eventually graduated from Strasburg High School, but I moved here, and I lived in 3 different places by then. You know, every 4 or 5 years, my family moved, and the one thing I always did is I read the local newspaper just to see what this area is like. And I pick up a paper, and within months of me being there, I'm reading about the squatters. And I'm thinking, I'm just trying to wrap my mind around the idea of a national park, which we didn't have national parks in the state of Illinois that I was aware of. But I come here and we're talking about a national recreation area and the dam and all this stuff going on. And then a few months later, they're talking about trying to move squatters out. And I was just fascinated that something like this goes on. It's the first time I've been exposed to it. And, uh, and then since then, in Monroe County, there were about 40,000 people who lived in the county in 1970. And then by 2010, it was around 170,000. And we've had all this growth, yet most of the people who moved in have no idea how this area developed. And to me, it was like this area's creation story. And I thought it was compelling as anything that goes on in any other part of the country. And I thought it was a fascinating a fascinating story to document. And there have been a lot of books and some good books that have been written about Tocks Island, but I felt there was nothing that focused primarily on the local people, how it impacted them, and how they did more than anybody else to stop it. Because as I said earlier, if it wasn't the turning of public opinion here locally, I think the dam would have been built regardless. Because if people are in favor of it, they would say, "Oh, we can solve any environmental issues that'll come up." But once the public opinion was against it, I think that the politicians, the U.S. senators, the congressmen and congresswomen, and the governors, they saw the public opinion changing, and they thought that, yeah, we better shut this thing down.
What happened to Nancy's involvement after she became a commissioner?
Well, she she in the early 70s, she came to chair the three-member board in her second term, and she served at least 3 terms. I think she tried to run for the U.S. House, but she lost that race. But she served at least 3 and maybe 4 terms. I just don't remember, as a county commissioner. And but she kind of has had legendary and significance among the local populace, that that one woman could do all this stuff, working from nothing, and just as time went on, learning more and more and trying more different things, and working with other people, allies as well as adversaries. And she eventually retired. She passed on sometime in the last 5 years or so, but I don't remember. It's harder for me to keep track of the years as I get older, but she's no longer with us, but she was very outgoing for a long time, even into her old age, and attended a lot of forums and meetings, received lots of proclamations and awards like years afterwards.
Yeah, and I just saw one comment that says she passed in 2021.
Okay.
So this is more of a comment, very interesting. I was in college in PA during the 60s when this was a huge issue. Husband and I were opposed to the dam, although living in Western PA. Strange turns of events. She now lives in New Jersey and works as a volunteer in the New Jersey Endangered Species Program, monitoring New Jersey eagles nests and reporting on nesting season, chicks, etc. One nest she monitors is on Tocks Island. It's been very productive for a decade or more. So happy there's no dam or lake there.
Wow, that's a nice story to hear.
Certainly is. Uh, how are the how are utilities utilizing today the land they did not give back around Sunfish Pond?
Uh, how are the utilities faring? Is that what the question is?
Yes, how are the utilities utilizing today the land they did not give back?
Oh, okay. Well, part of it is that it's so complicated. I wasn't sure how to broach it without really getting perhaps off topic. But in the early 60s, they did build a pump storage facility, but it was on private property right next to the park. And they still operate the reservoir, and it's on Yards Creek, which is on the not really part of the National Recreation Area or part of the state forest, but uh, but they do have an upper and a lower reservoir, 4 Yards Creek, and that went online in 1965. And I don't know this for sure, but I suspect that they built that partly as a demonstration project to show the federal government this is what we can do. And in the mid 70s, there was even concerns that the utilities, there were suspicions that the utilities wanted to build nuclear power plants downstream, towards Trenton to Philadelphia, down in that area, and that they were going to build all these pump storage units just so that they could send water downstream to cool the reactors whenever they needed to do that to keep the nuclear plants safe and functioning. And I know I have hiked through there a couple of times, and I remember looking down at one of those pump storage reservoirs as I was hiking along. But beyond that, I'm not sure specifically what they're doing with that land, but I do know they have some property that was unrelated to the purchases from the state. And then the other thing is that originally that state forest there was going to be part of the National Recreation Area. But as it turned out, New Jersey has held on to that, and they still operate it as a park, but they cooperate a lot with the National Park Service. And one of the toughest hiking trails in the park, it starts out in the state forest, Worthington Forest, and then it goes into the National Recreation Area, and then it comes back out again into the state forest as you come down off the peak and that you're hiking. And they work very well together. And I full disclosure, I serve on an advisory board currently for the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area, and just thought I would throw that out there so people know that when I start talking about relations between NPS and the New Jersey Forestry Service. But all indications are that they work very well together, and there's a lot of sightseeing and looking at waterfalls and hiking trails that traverse both areas.
Right. Why is it called Tocks Island?
I have no idea, and I've searched that myself, and I actually saw a map which I think it was more than 100 years old. It was a real old map, and I know sometimes I misspell names, but they actually called it Cocks Island on this map, and I have done a few searches trying to find out why it's called Tocks, and no one seems to know. but it it's just funny how the name Tocks Island became shorthand for everything that's happened there with the recreation area and with the dam proposals.
Certainly has. Is there a plaque or memorial commemorating Nancy's activism?
Uh, there certainly have been some proclamations, but there's no plaque that I know of in federal or state lands that recognize her contribution in that way. Certainly have been a lot of legislative and proclamations.
Right, so Waterloo Valley Saxon Falls area was also slated to be dammed for a reservoir. From what she understands, it was a bust because of all the shale in the land, but it was this effort in any way related to Tocks Island not moving forward, or perhaps it was in the 60s and to the shale, the effort turned to Tocks Island.
Is there a question in there, or is that just a comment?
Okay. So the project was a bust because of all the shale in the land, but was this effort in any way related to Tocks Island not moving forward?
I'm not sure. What was the name of this project again?
Waterloo Valley Saxon Falls, and it was slated to be dammed for a reservoir.
Yeah, I'm just not familiar with that project. I'm sorry that I'm unable to answer that question. I know we had that earlier commentator, the one who worked with bird rehab that used to live in Western PA, and but there is a Kinswood Dam in Western Pennsylvania, which was built, I think, in the early 60s. And there's a Seneca Nation Indian cemetery there that had to be moved for that reservoir. And I think that was probably one of the last groups of Native Americans having a presence in Western Pennsylvania, a formal presence at least. And although the Senecas, they do have a reservation in Western New York State, not too far from there.
Hey, do you have a sense of how many residents that were displaced stayed in the area and how many left?
No, not really. I know a lot of people did stay behind, and some of them I've talked to refuse to ever set foot again. They won't go back to where their house used to be, but they live in the area and work here, have a lot of relationships that they formed when they were young. But I even had trouble finding out how many total parcels there were because so many of these land transfer cases ended up in federal court, and a lot of them, especially in the New Jersey side, that ended up in federal court. That the federal authorities, once there was a court settlement, they didn't do a formal deed transfer in the deeds office in New Jersey or the proprietary's office in Pennsylvania. You're supposed to file those deeds, and because that there are a lot of properties that didn't happen, I do not have a firm handle. My best guess is that there are maybe 7,300 parcels that were transferred, but that's just a guess. And you know, I've heard others use that number, but a lot of these cases I had to track down by going through the National Archives, where they stored old court cases that were so old that even the federal district court didn't have them anymore. and I had to track them down in the National Archives. And then I finally found out the location of where they were, but the National Archives said that because of the pandemic, we're only doing emergency requests right now, and you're going to have to wait. And I waited a few months on that, and finally I did get some information on court cases involving a few hundred parcels, but I'm sure that there are more cases that are probably in the National Archives that I did not get to.
Okay, I do want to thank Brian Coons for connecting us. It's about 9, so I'm sorry to say I can't get to all the questions, but I do want to say thank you to everyone. If I can get a hold of the questions, I will email them.
Okay.
And then maybe we'll post them on our Facebook at DRGP. Sorry, at Delaware River Greenway Partnership is our Facebook. So thank you so much, David, for all this really interesting information. And thank you everyone for joining us. And I hope everyone has a great night.
Well, thank you for allowing me to share their story, which I thoroughly, even though it's a tough thing to deal with, I did enjoy the research and bringing to life some of these individuals and their stories and how they persevered. And thank you very much for allowing me to share that with your audience.
Well, thank you again.
Good night.
Good night.